Excellent. Well, thank you everybody who's joined us today. We're very excited to have you here for this session. My name is Josh Kaplan with the Clean Energy Buyers Association, and we are thrilled today to be here for Guiding Principles for Community, Conservation, and Climate in PPA Procurement. This session is based on a recently released white paper from the Nature Conservancy, LevelTen Energy, and Audubon. And we're really excited to be able to talk about it. It's very relevant to a lot of the work being done through the Beyond the Megawatt program with the Clean Energy Buyers Institute. So today we are really thrilled and honored to have with us Nathan Cummins, Strategy Director at the Nature Conservancy, Zach Starja, Director of Transactions at LevelTen Energy, Ryan Spicer, a Senior Sustainability Manager with PepsiCo, and Jeff West, Senior Director of Environmental Strategy with Xcel Energy. Senior Director of Environmental Services. Sorry, Jeff. And they're going to be, Nathan and Zach are going to be diving in to what's in the white paper and the principles and outlines. And Ryan and Jeff are going to be answering some questions about how they are beginning to implement the principles outlined in the white paper into their work. So we're really excited to bring this to you today. For those of you who are new, I just wanted to quickly go over our antitrust reminder. We put this at the beginning of all of our sessions, so many of you have seen this before, but just in case you haven't, please don't discuss any non-public or competitively sensitive information during these sessions, particularly when you get to things like the Q&A session. That's just a good practice to follow to avoid any problems later. And we also just want to give a very big thanks to the event sponsors that made this possible. Schneider Electric, Avangrid Renewables, Edison Energy, and Marathon Capital. Thank you for your sponsorship of this event. It means so much to be able to bring everybody together. Thank you also to the members of the Clean Energy Buyers Association. It is really, your support of this community that is making this possible, and even these sessions, which are hosted by the Clean Energy Buyers Institute. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Nathan Cummins, who from the Nature Conservancy, who is going to walk us through our agenda for the session.
Great. Thanks so much, Josh. So just, before we get started, a couple housekeeping items. We're going to have about 20-25 minutes where we're going to walk through the content of the white paper. We're going to do a facilitated discussion with Ryan and Jeff, and then we'll hopefully have time at the end for audience questions. So if you could save your questions to the end, that's great. We'll have the chat function available, so feel free to put those in. And then Josh is going to be monitoring that to make sure we move things forward. Also, just note, this first part of the session is being recorded. That's for internal purposes. When we actually get to the point of having more of an audience Q&A, we're going to stop the recording. It'll be pretty obvious, and it'll be opportunity for a more facilitated dialogue. So with that, as Josh said, my name is Nathan. I direct TNC's renewable energy strategy for our Great Plains states, and I also lead our global corporate engagement work around renewable energy, with a specific focus on collaborating with renewable energy buyers and organizations like CEBA. On behalf of Zach and myself and our organizations, we'd like to thank the CEBA for hosting this important presentation and dialogue, and thanks to Ryan from Pepsi and Jeff from Xcel for joining us to share lessons and learnings with peers across the industry. We want to make sure folks know we brought in Ryan and Jeff, who you'll hear from here in the second half of the presentation, because they represent two companies who are on the leading edge of incorporating community conservation and climate strategies into renewable energy. They also represent two very different perspectives on renewable energy purchasing and developing, from a company like PepsiCo looking towards global ambitions to a utility like Xcel, both buying and developing renewables across multiple markets in the United States. And both companies are trying to meet ambitious climate targets while stewarding the environment and serving their communities and customers. So just to provide a quick overview of how we're going to spend our time together, Zach and myself are going to be talking about the key learnings of a white paper we co-authored along with the National Audubon Society, trying to answer the question, how can we maximize, as a community that is all interested in clean energy, our positive environmental and social impacts while we rapidly transition to a clean energy economy? We'll then have this facilitated dialogue and reserve time at the end for audience Q&A. We hope folks leave this session with a greater understanding of the opportunities to advance co-benefits in both PPAs and other factors within the market. We also recognize that we are not the only companies, organizations, or voices that are important in this dialogue. There are many folks that have worked on this, such as Salesforce, Google, Groundswell, and even CEBA's Beyond the Megawatt campaign, as well as many frontline advocates and organizations that are critical to advancing shared goals in this space. We don't intend to speak for them, but we do hope is to start a conversation of how, as an industry, we can coalesce around ambitious but achievable principles to advance community conservation and climate goals. And lastly, please don't be shy. Reach out to Zach and I after the presentation if you'd like to be more involved in this work. So with that, why don't we go to the next slide? So just to provide a little more context of who's all in the room and what do we represent, we wanted to get a sense of where are you based? This is not actually so yeah, where are you based? What region are you interested in? So feel free to fill this out. Are you coming to us from North America, coming to us more from global regions? So we'll run this poll just real quickly to get a sense of where folks are at. So if you could run the poll. And I see here, so our poll questions, so these are actually the answers to what we were going for. And this is more, what organization, what are you bringing into this community? So share, are you a buyer, developer, service provider? And this is more just to get a sense of who's all coming into this room. So we can go ahead and share the live results of the poll here, and we had a good amount of answers here. And what I'm seeing here is we have a broad spectrum of interest and organizational opportunities. So that's really great. We hope every organization can see themselves, or participants see themselves in this discussion. So Josh, you want to go ahead and go to the next slide? Here's the question we're going for, but then we'll go to the next slide and actually jump into the presentation. Yeah, so more about us and the white paper. So the white paper, we titled it Beyond Carbon Free. It was released earlier this week. It was a collaboration between the Nature Conservancy, which is the world's largest environmental nonprofit, LevelTen Energy, which, as Zach will elaborate on, operates the largest renewable energy marketplace, and the National Audubon Society, one of the preeminent experts on biodiversity and renewable energy, that has science showing that upwards of 400 species of North American birds may go extinct if we can't control the climate crisis. Pepsi and Xcel have happily joined us, but they have not been involved in this white paper. They're here instead to sort of have a live conversation showing how their company could take learnings from this white paper and how their company interests align around community conservation and climate goals. So we'll have a link to that white paper shared in the chat here in a little bit, and we can go ahead and go to the next slide, Josh. So just a little context. For some, this may be obvious. For others, it may be new. What we all know are policy and markets have aligned to rapidly advance the enabling conditions for renewable energy. Luckily, the clean energy transition is here. And that's great, because decarbonizing the energy system is one of the most important tasks we all have to do to tackle the climate crisis. Renewable energy is inherently clean and provides a ton of co-benefits in terms of public health, reduced emissions, and economic development for climate and communities. However, we are also going to have to rapidly advance the pace and scale of deployment, and this is going to result in a massive energy infrastructure build out to tackle the climate crisis. Some estimates say we need at least 10 times the current amount of installed renewables to meet Paris goals, and that's likely not going to be enough because the world, led by many progressive companies that are on the Zoom here today, is exploring deep decarbonization and net zero commitments. We also need to recognize that utility scale wind and solar, like really any energy system, they can take up a lot of land. And these systems can provide known direct and indirect impacts to habitat and wildlife if they are not properly sited. For example, Princeton recently came out with a study that estimates for the US to meet net zero commitments by 2050, we're going to need the combined land area of Colorado and Wyoming just for deploying onshore renewables. Now that's a lot of land. And further, this build out is going to affect communities everywhere. Hopefully there will no longer be marginalized frontline communities sharing the burden of energy systems like transitions of the past. In this new clean energy economy, every community will need to be a host community, whether it is for utility scale systems, solar farms, gardens, rooftop installations, or even transmission battery and other infrastructure. And that gets us to the crux of the issue we're here today to talk about. The land and resources needed to install these systems, along with the fact that they will need to go in a lot of places, inherently will lead to social, environmental, and land use conflicts that are already threatening to slow down the clean energy transition. Experts across the industry are coalescing that now the biggest challenge facing us is not setting the enabling conditions for growth, but is instead figuring out how we will actually deploy at the pace and scale needed to make this happen. And we cannot afford to delay this transition. For example, we have data showing that renewable energy projects deployed in areas with low biodiversity have significantly quicker permitting times, face less delays, and face a significantly less risk of being canceled compared to projects built in existing habitat and wildlife. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, Josh. But luckily, I'm not here to be just doom and gloom. we have a huge opportunity to advance a build out that encompasses community conservation and climate goals. For example, my organization has done science to show globally, we have 17 times the amount of land needed to meet Paris Agreement goals for renewable deployment by solely focusing deployment on areas with low biodiversity significance. Now, this is a ton of land. That's way more than we'll need. And this figure stays true to varying degrees, even as you zoom in on the top 10 global renewable energy markets. It's an incredibly positive opportunity that we think we can advance a better build out if we work together to think about what are those right enabling conditions. Next slide, Josh. Go ahead and go back one. Yeah, perfect. So, this better build out, when we think about it, it's one that can prioritize community co-benefits. It can set up policies to ensure meaningful community input without risking negative policies such as moratoriums or unrealistic demands. It can protect wildlife and habitat by co-locating wind and solar on existing lands, such as non-prime agriculture, lands without significant biodiversity, brownfields, or other built infrastructure. And this can avoid impacts to key habitats that certainly might be windy or sunny, but are probably better kept wild, such as our last remaining tall grass prairie in the central US, where we only have less than 5% of this iconic landscape left. And lastly, this build out can optimize climate impacts, both in terms of where the systems go to ensure we are able to decrease emissions and advance public health in these key communities, and how they're put on the ground to make sure we don't remove important tools from our toolbox, like natural climate solutions for managing carbon, like forests. So if you want to go to the next slide, Josh. So why us? Well, we came together, and I say we, meaning LevelTen, the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, to push a partnership because we thought we brought different expertise to the table in terms of planning, siting, and buying of renewables. We think these are three key pillars to advance community conservation and climate interests in the clean energy build out. And we wanted to put principles on paper that builds on the great work throughout the community and provides guideposts we can collectively work towards. We hope this is just the beginning of a robust conversation in this space. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-author, Zach, to introduce himself and dive deeper into the contents of the white paper.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Nathan. And I think LevelTen's sort of role here is, I think as a renewable transactions infrastructure provider for the industry, we're going to enable gigawatts of new renewable energy capacity to be built, and embedding these types of principles into our technology platform will allow buyers to discover project opportunities that may have otherwise gone unrecognized or unnoticed from developers. We're also providing developers, right, a platform to describe their unique aspects of their projects and perhaps set themselves apart from the pack for buyers like Ryan and Jeff. So next slide. Thanks. So here at LevelTen, we do think of the PPA procurement as a journey because it can take a long time to source and execute a PPA with a renewable energy project and work with a developer. Oftentimes, this takes many internal and external stakeholders to approve a PPA. It could include folks in finance, accounting, tax, treasury, legal, and marketing, just to name a few. I'm sure Ryan has had experience with this internally at Pepsi, and perhaps you can talk about this later. But oftentimes, step one is setting up that procurement goal, right? And perhaps harmonizing principles across the company. For corporate renewable energy buyers, this often starts with a public commitment to RE100, science-based target initiatives, or more recently, those 24/7 carbon-free energy models, or for utility companies, perhaps an integrated resource plan from state regulatory process, right? That may drive renewable energy adoption at the corporate level or at the utility level. But deciding what criteria are important to your company and what story do you want to tell at the end of this journey is really important to set yourself up for success. Step two being qualification criteria. So depending on the volume of a specific transaction, the location of that transaction, and many other factors, it's not uncommon for a corporate renewable energy buyer to receive over 100 proposals in response to a demand signal in the marketplace. So buyers need to think about these threshold criteria for which to advance or eliminate projects further for consideration, and concentrating the efforts on projects and responses that meet those criteria and are expected to perform well better compared to other available options. Step three being due diligence, but once a subset of projects is identified, buyers often conduct additional project and counterparty due diligence, right? So exchanging commercial terms is a common step here, providing additional detail about the project development status, amongst other things. But I think regardless if you're a corporate or utility buyer, A second phase of enhanced due diligence will help inform what's the right project for the company. And then ultimately figuring out what that right project is. So right after this robust process that started off with over 100 offers, whittling down to a short list, then beyond to finalists and the awarded project, you're presenting to senior leadership often a selection of projects that meet those criteria, but often comes with a recommendation from the project evaluation team. And I think here, just the last piece is just that buyers should probably also consider the long-term relationship that they have with their project, right? Xcel purchases projects in a different capacity than Pepsi, and that relationship between project and buyer is a long-term relationship that could be 10 to 15 years, oftentimes for corporate buyers, but for some utility buyers, that may be the useful life of that facility if they purchase that outright. So I'll go to the next slide. So how do you figure out what that right project is, right? I think there's a voice to sort of bring the 3C principles into this framework, right? So gigawatts of carbon-free electricity have already been built thanks to a lot of the corporate and utility buyers before us on this call, right? So past 10 years, renewable energy adoption has accelerated quite significantly. But the key will be, how do we create a sustainable build out, right? Of projects that maximize the benefits that these assets can bring. And if they're ignored, the industry may suffer from bad actors that overlook these important considerations, right? Nathan already mentioned moratoriums, that could be an outgrowth of some of these bad actors, if you will. But our white paper outlines a few principles that buyers can latch onto that will help inform more intentional and potentially more impactful long-term decisions for community, conservation, and climate. And when implemented properly, these principles will discover additional benefits that would have otherwise gone unnoticed and amplify the decisions that prioritize the people and planet and not necessarily profit first. These principles also provide developers the opportunity to create best practices that may attract buyers to their projects. And we're going to hear from our panelists later about how these concepts factor into their decision-making processes. We'll jump forward. Great, so we're going to just do a quick poll here. Just, I think whether you're a buyer or you're a developer, you can kind of read these questions differently, but how much does your current practice align with the 3C's principles, right? So from a buyer perspective, are you embedding these today? Do you have alignment? Do you have no alignment? From a developer perspective, are these things that you do, is this part of your lifeblood at the development company? Is these things that you think about all the time, or are they not yet a piece of how you go and site your projects? And what C has the most opportunity for implementation, right? Where do you see the most perhaps opportunity and runway to increase visibility on one of these 3Cs? Great, we'll leave it open for a few more seconds. All right. Great, thanks so much. Looks like folks are trying to learn a little bit more about what we have to say on the topic and hopefully looking to embed these principles into their journey. And looks like climate is perhaps the biggest opportunity for implementation for your organization. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail. So we can jump forward. Great, so just thinking back to that step 2, which is qualification criteria, there's kind of 2 different categories of these criteria, if you will. So we have elimination criteria and we also have selection criteria, right? So elimination criteria are really meant to be these bright line or binary criteria that may remove a project or offer for further evaluation, right? So just as an example from this tick list here, if from a conservation lens, right? If the project negatively impacts important habitats, which this may be something that Jeff brings up a little bit later, but that may be a bright line issue where, hey, all else equal, we can't really advance this project with these significant concerns. So that's just an example of an elimination criteria. But the flip side of that coin is a selection criteria, right? And those are meant to identify unique project opportunities or characteristics that may otherwise have gone unnoticed, right? So, and you take that conservation one again here, just on the other side of that coin. if a project is sited on a previously disturbed land, brownfields, landfills, et cetera, that may be a unique storytelling opportunity for a corporate buyer or a utility buyer to advance a project further, right? So there's elimination criteria that sort of help, broad strokes, eliminate projects further and really concentrate our efforts on projects that meet certain minimum criteria. And we can jump.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in here and just talk a little bit more about the due diligence process. So as Zach said, we have, from when you get to those high level, then obviously you're going to get to a short list of projects, and you're not going to be able to, every project can't answer every question. So it's thinking about those deep conversations. And this is something I know Ryan at Pepsi did a lot of with the folks he worked with. So I'm curious to hear his thoughts when we get to the discussion on it. But it's talking about how can you do some due diligence. And so one example of a resource from the conservation side, and we'll share resources on all of this, is the Nature Conservancy site renewables right map. And so this is just a high level overview map that we have a map for wind, and we will be releasing a map for solar here in the coming weeks that looks at what are some of those known either direct or indirect impacts from renewable energy systems and how can those be avoided. And so this is a free resource that is a combination of over 100 different data sets worked through the best available science, state fish and wildlife agency partners, other folks in the nonprofit and science space to understand where are areas where there might be potential impacts, and then how can we have a collaborative conversation. So from a buyer perspective, this can be used to help screen projects to understand what risks might be there. That if you don't have a PhD in this stuff, it's not necessarily as clear. And then also from a developer side, this can be really used in sort of real estate development and understanding when folks are getting out the door to think about those leases and where those projects are, what are some concerns and how do you best address those concerns with the key partners like state wildlife agencies, et cetera. So this is free to download, and there's a lot of other resources like this. So this certainly isn't the only one, and we outline more of these in the white paper. So we can go to the next slide.
Great. And as it relates to communities, I think we recognize that frontline communities are often, some of the highest risk populations when citing large infrastructure projects such as renewable energy. But the benefits of these projects should be shared across the community and provide long-term wealth and health opportunities where possible. Buyers may choose to collaborate with their developer partners on workforce development initiatives within diverse populations, providing long-term economic opportunities in clean energy construction and operation. But using like the EPA's EJ screen tool, which is here on the screen on the right, and EJ here standing for Environmental Justice Screening Tool, can be a great indicator of a project's attributes as it relates to environmental and demographic indicators. And buyers broadly can use this information to understand the types of populations around a project's physical location, right? You put a pin on this map, you draw a buffer around it for 50 or 100 miles to really understand what's that mosaic of population and of folks around a specific location. And developers, on the flip side here, they may choose to sponsor a community project after listening to local stakeholders, right? These are called community benefit agreements to understand their pain points and provide solutions that address those issues specifically, right? So listening and really understanding what issues we're trying to address. Great. Oh, and finally here on climate. Yeah, so there's already a lot of great work underway here with regards to carbon displacement for renewable energy. I think that's one of the kind of key things from a project perspective from displacing carbon. But not every project is created equal in terms of its carbon displacement potential, right? So here on the right is a map from Wattheim, who's done quite a bit of research and work in this area. But here on the West Coast, if you're looking at California, Oregon, and Washington, those states are green, which means that they're have higher renewable energy and clean energy sources when compared to states in the Midwest and even in Colorado and Wyoming, right? So you can get more bang for your buck or more green for your megawatt hour. You want to think of it that way. When you're located in a dirtier grid when compared to a cleaner grid. So just another way to think about how you can most significantly impact climate.
Yeah, you can go, yep. And then lastly here, just to sort of close out this part of it, how can you help? How can you sort of join our herd here and how we're working on this together? Well, first, we think there's a real opportunity to adopt the 3C principles into your renewable procurement efforts. I saw from the poll, there's a majority, if not most of the folks on the Zoom here, either are working already towards alignment or really see that there's a recognition on these issues. And we try to keep these principles broad enough that we're not being as structured in terms of how they are operationalized. And we hope that they can be applied in different forums, in different industries within your company, and really provide guideposts for both yourselves, your company's leadership, and then the broader community. We also think that there's a real need to develop better recognition of the work that's already happening in this space. We really want to see this as an opportunity to elevate best practices on both the buying and the developing side. This should reward all market participants that are leaning into these efforts. And we're really curious, as a community, what your thoughts are on that and where that could be helpful in terms of thinking through what type of recognition would help advance these interests within your company. And lastly, we really hope for more collaboration on this. As I started off at the beginning, we know we're not the only organizations in this space. We know we're not the only voices that are important here. And we hope to continue this dialogue. We did think it was important to start coalescing these different work streams into a broad sense of principles, and then gather feedback and advance through other great initiatives, like the like CEBA's Beyond the Megawatt initiative and others. So with that, that's kind of an overview of our white paper. We're going to turn it now to have a more facilitated conversation with Ryan and Jeff, and then we'll leave certainly a good amount of time at the end for questions, both on the white paper for Zach and I, but I think more importantly, questions from your peers to Ryan and Jeff. So with that, Josh, why don't we go ahead and stop screen sharing just so it'll be a little easier to have this conversation. Great, thanks. So to start us off here, I'm gonna do the first question, and then Zach and I are gonna go back and forth here. This is both to Ryan and Jeff. Ryan, why don't you answer it first? It would be great if you all could just provide an overview of your roles at your companies. Why you thought it was important for your company to join this discussion, because I think both Pepsi and Xcel have ambitious sustainability, climate, and social responsibility targets. So just, talk, how have you used your role with renewable energy to help implement and connect those goals?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nathan, and thanks for having me here today. It's really great to talk about this topic, and thanks for the white paper you guys put together. It's really great read. Encourage everyone else to go out there and read through it as well. So I work for our global sustainability team here at PepsiCo, and I specifically work on our climate team. So I'm looking after our Scope 1 and our Scope 2 decarbonization efforts globally across all of our manufacturing and fleets. I work with all of our different business units around the world and how we're going to accomplish that, and the strategies and tactics that we're going to use between now and 2030 to achieve some really ambitious but very necessary climate goals within the organization. Part of that remit includes the ways we address our Scope 2 emissions. And I would say PepsiCo has been working on Scope 2 emissions for quite a long time. Maybe over 10 years ago, we had done a lot of work in renewable electricity. It was a lot of focus on on-site renewables, but we'd also bought a lot of unbundled RECs, and we had addressed like really large markets for us in the world. But that wasn't really a very robust, very mature program that we had. It was really great at the time. I think it was really forward thinking at the time, but it wasn't necessarily a long-term play. And so a couple of years ago, we went back and we looked and we said, how do we pick up the ball on renewable electricity and pick it up and move forward and advance it, but do so in a way that's going to have a long-lasting impact in our decisions around how we procure renewable electricity. So I started working with our North American teams on how to do this. And so we knew pretty early on that it was going to be difficult and challenging, and that we were going to have to look at power purchase agreements as a way to obtain renewables. We decided pretty early that we wanted to do something that was going to have the most sustainability impact that we could drive. So we wanted to do PPAs with new projects, new wind, new solar. Maybe not going so far as addressing the 24/7 carbon aspects of that, which I think is great. The companies are doing that. That's something we aspire to do. But looking to say, like, how do we have an impact and drive a long-term impact for renewables for our company in different markets around the world? So we kind of put that as like our North Star and said we want to add renewable electricity to the grid. We want to be 100%. So I started working with a couple of different teams. We decided, that this was something that's going to be really super important for us to do. And, going to a power purchase agreement, our definition of a long-term contract is much, much shorter than what you see in typical PPAs. And so you get into this mindset of, wow, this is a really long-term engagement. I really want to know the counterparties that I'm working with. I want to feel super comfortable with the projects that we're focusing on. I want to be really thoughtful about the actions that we take, because there's going to be actions that we're going to live with for the next 10, 15, 20 years in many circumstances. And so really taking a nice, long, slow look at, beyond just like, what are the economics of the projects and where are the projects going to be located and who are those counterparties, but what are all those other tangible and intangible elements of what this project is going to do in terms of its impact on the environment, on wildlife, on the communities where it's located. So, for us, and sort of starting that journey or restarting that journey at least, it was really important for us to think about that. And so I've been part of that conversation and very much involved with our teams and how we do that. Nathan, I reached out to you and the Nature Conservancy many times along the way to have these conversations to educate our organization so that we could have more informed discussions with developers. And that's kind of what's brought us to where we are today. And looking forward to seeing how we can evolve that process and make it a little bit better for us, because I would encourage anyone who's thinking about, whether it's, on-site or off-site, renewable projects, that, think about the long-term, think about the multiple aspects that are going along with this, and think about how you can do more than just use renewable electricity or lower your scope 2 emissions, but think about ways you can drive a more positive benefit in the communities and in the world with these projects, these opportunities you have.
Great. Thanks so much, Ryan. And Jeff, curious your thoughts on this question.
Yeah. Thank you, Nathan. Appreciate the time today, and welcome to everybody who's come here. A lot of the things Ryan said are very similar to where we are at the Xcel Energy, so I'm not going to repeat those that much, but the dynamic that we bring is a little bit different. Is we're actually the power utility here. So Xcel Energy, for those of you who don't know, is a publicly owned, investor-owned utility. However, we are a regulated utility. That means that the markets that we are in, we are required to go through a regulatory commission to determine the costs and the projects and demonstrate prudency with everything that we do. We are essentially a legalized monopoly, as you could say, in that area, that is kept tempered from where we are. Xcel Energy, a couple of years ago, had a very, very ambitious carbon vision. We were the first utility to present that we were going to be 80% reduced by 2030 of our 2005 levels and 100% carbon free by 2050. Since then, we've seen many other utilities and so forth come out along that space. We've seen aggressive state and federal administration goals in carbon and climate. And we've recently aligned our gas system with that as well, with our most recent announcement where we have a 25% reduction on our gas side and a net zero by 2050 on that side as well. And so working in that utility space, we of course want to own, being an investor, you own utility, everything we can in that. But being a regulated utility, we cannot own everything that's in there. So we have different paradigms that we work in as far as working with the aspects to make this transformation. Going with that vision, there is just a large transformation that is going to have to happen as we go from the traditional methods of thermal and spinning mass and other generation to a more renewable space with storage and other technologies that are in place with that. And that transformation is very important to us, as we as Xcel Energy have a tagline that says responsible by nature. So when we talk about the 3 C's that Zach talked about, or ESG activities that we have in that, it's very important that we have the right partners and the right people as we go forth with that. Projects that we look at can be anything from what we call a self-build, where a project will come to us from a developer and then we will actually go out and build that and own that. There could be a build-own transfer, where a developer, somebody will come and build a project and then we'll take that over. Or the last space is a PPA that we have with that. But all of those align to our carbon vision, because we're not only tracking and adjusting and meeting our goals within what we generate, but it's what we bring onto the system as well. And so how we do that is very, very important, to have the right partners, the right aspects, and actually the right mindset in that ESG or 3C space to do that correctly as we move forward. Many individuals or other activities don't really understand the activities that go around the actual due diligence, development, and construction of a large project with this. These things take up massive areas. We've got wind farms that are over 100,000 acres. And you think about threatened and endangered species, state protected species, Bald Eagle and Gold Eagle Protection Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, cultural, biological, archaeological, Native American, state historical, all of those come into play. And all of those are decisions in every single facility we make. It is not just economic. Economic is one component of that. Our customers demand that. We demand that from our vision, and now our regulatory commissions are coming as well. So we're committed to doing this, to doing it right. We think we're the right people to do it. I mean, we've been providing power for 100 years, and we want to set the standard for how everybody else does that. And so we're anxious to hear what others have today, questions, comments, and what we do in the space for Xcel Energy for this.
Yeah, thanks so much for those comments, Jeff. And there's probably a similar thread that I'm going to probably pull on here. But as a recovering project developer myself, still after 4 or 5 years now, I think a lot of this conversation can probably lead to these thoughts on the developer side around increased costs, right? None of this stuff was going to come for free, right? Additional due diligence on the environmental side, concurrence with state and local wildlife officials. This is, just probably from a developer perspective, they see increased costs on their side of the ledger, right? And so I would just be curious from Jeff and Ryan, from your perspectives, right? How do you square this tension between, costs and going above and beyond kind of business as usual and sort of intentionally citing renewable energy projects with these kind of 3C principles in mind? Is this a trade-off that you think your companies are willing to make? Are they making them now? Will you be making those in the future? Those types of things.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start there if that's okay, Ryan.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. We're actually starting, we're doing that now. And we've done that on 3 of the last wind farms that we brought into existence. I'll bring up an example of a wind farm that we had down in New Mexico. Down in that area, the lesser prairie chicken is a large species of concern that was there. When we were building that wind farm, the lesser prairie chicken originally had been listed as threatened. Through some conservation efforts, it was deemed to be no longer threatened. And now, right now, it's under a proposal to be either threatened or endangered, depending upon which geographic region that you are with that. But at that particular time, when we were building that wind farm, we were under no obligation, being that it was not threatened or anything, to actually take mitigation measures associated with that. But we didn't see that as right, and we didn't see that as correct. And we partnered ourselves with the developer down there that, quite honestly, we just aligned them to where we were at and said, it's not acceptable to do nothing. We understand that there is a cost associated with this. We will address the prudency and the actions with our regulatory commissions as we gain approval for these particular projects. But it's up to us to be creative on how we define and determine what that aspect is. And so we went through that project, and through a large effort of siting and development, we took our original siting location, we carved off probably 50 turbines on the southeastern side of that were in prime lesser prairie chicken territory. Then we developed a strategy around fragmentation, LEX, habitat improvement development. There's what's called a critical habitat assessment tool, a chat tool that determines the level of habitat that's suitable for this, sited outside of those areas. All at the same time, we're still looking at NCF. We've got to make sure we've got the best wind coming in for that particular scenario. So we're balancing those aspects. We had large conversations with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, with the New Mexico Game and Fish, agreements in place. We brought in some really top-tier biologists around lesser prairie chicken development to determine the strategies that we developed. And in the end, we developed a strategy that allowed us to put in a very successful wind farm, but also protect that habitat from that lesser prairie chicken and potential areas that may have had an impact. And when I say may, I could say very little. We did mitigation banking, and we actually developed a mitigation bank just south of that facility in the prime area that protected this habitat for a certain amount of acres that we deemed we impacted on a 1-to-1 scenario. And we funded that event to allow those acres to last forever and to be in the actual region that they're at. It didn't go somewhere else. And so those are examples of the things we do. And as we move that through our regulatory commission, to a lot of people's surprise, they were happy to be there, because it wasn't just to open it up. It was, let's take the most active approach we can that can allow the wind farm to continue to promote, but also be protective of the species that's in place. And we see that across all of our jurisdictions. And it could be anything from a sage grouse to a toad to a grassland to a Native American to an archaeological. All of that are brought into play. And that is something that, I will be honest, a lot of our developers, we've had to bring them along because they've always brought us a cost based upon the lowest potential impact. And that never a lot of times brings these activities in. And we want to make sure that we're having the conversations with the right people, the right agencies, and the right actions with that. And then, not to take up the other time, because I know Ryan's got some great stuff too. The last part of that is the community action. You know, we are putting these facilities right in the backyards of some of the communities that are out there, and they need to be involved with the process. They need to understand, they need to come along with us. And we need to keep them educated on what we're doing, how we're doing, why we're doing, and being responsive to their actions.
That's excellent, Jeff. Thanks. From the PepsiCo perspective, I would say, you know, we're just like, I don't think we're any different from any other large corporate buyer, right? We're very risk averse, right? And this is not our bread and butter. I'm not starting a business where we're going to go out and use PPAs to make money for our organization, right? We have our business that we know very well. And this is something that we want to do because it's important for our sustainability journey. So that being said, anyone who's ever been through the PPA process, it's an exercise in trade-offs. And we look for many opportunities to de-risk these projects. You know, I don't want development risk. I don't want production risk. You know, trying to find ways to reduce pricing risk. I mean, there's all kinds of things in here that we're willing to de-risk. And so for us, you know, the investment in doing the proper due diligence to make sure the project is going to be viable for the long term and that it's not going to create additional risk, like those are investments well made. And if you think about the value of the brands and the reputation, aside from just the project risk, you know, those investments and the long-term nature of these projects, it's a very small investment from my perspective in terms of what it means for our reputation, not just the brand reputation, but the corporate reputation. Like, we talk a big sustainability game and we intend to back it up. And so looking at the long-term nature of these projects, you know, those are things that I think, you know, it's very important for us to have. At the end of the day, what I'm most interested in is getting more renewables on the grid. And if we can get that with a reasonable commercial terms and something that we can live with, that's money well spent. And that's a great project for us to tie our name to and to be a part of. And so for us, you know, anything we can do to de-risk these projects and make them viable for the long term so that they're good for us and good for the community and good for the world. I mean, those are great things, and we understand there's going to be trade-offs, and those are trade-offs I think we're considerate of and willing to make, and something that, you know, is important for anybody else to consider when they're looking at these types of projects.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. I really liked how you kind of led off that, you know, from the corporate responsibility side as well. And I've got another question on that, but just before I do, just, you know, we've just got a couple more questions here sort of pre-existing, but feel free to start thinking about other questions for the panelists, for Zach and myself. You can send those to Josh, you can put those in the chat. We'll try to get to as many as we can. And for ones that we can't, we'll be able to follow up, assuming that that's of interest to you. So I guess my next question for both Ryan and Jeff is, you know, let's talk about a little more kind of external facing and the need for collaboration. So it's important to bring partners along to implement these principles related to conservation, climate, and communities in these renewables projects, both from an external perspective and also an internal perspective. So could you just share a little bit about, you know, how you view the role of collaboration internally? What are some of those partners you worked with that you may not have worked with in the past? And then also externally, you know, how did you understand and bring the right voices into the room to make those critical decisions?
I can start us off, Jeff. I would say, you know, that, you know, we had done prior to 2019, maybe we had done 1 or 2 PPAs globally that really sort of ad hoc approaches. You know, we've done a lot of on-site renewable. We've done some small, you know, maybe on-site PPAs, but nothing like really big, really large scale. It's very different for us. And then back in 2019, we really started to ramp up the programs. Immediately apparent to us that this is a new space, but we don't have a lot of experience, and we're not sure that we know all the right questions to ask. Internally, you know, it's like anyone who's willing to raise their hand and participate is going to be part of at least like the broader team. And then some people who maybe didn't raise their hand are going to be part of the broader team as well. And we brought in some outside experts from, you know, the energy space, legal, in terms of like understanding the market. It's great. But when it came time to working with and speaking with developers, especially when you get to the point where maybe like Zach said, you started with like over 100 proposals, and now you've got down to maybe like the 2 or 3 that you think are really the best opportunities for you. You want to make sure that you have a great long-term partner. And for me, a great partner isn't someone who necessarily has a crystal ball and knows all the answers and can predict everything that's possibly going to happen, but someone who's, in that same line of thinking as you are with their approach to risk aversity and saying, we will work together on whatever problems we know are today, we'll fix those. And then whatever problems we might come up in the future, we'll be partners and we'll work on these two things together. I think for us to understand, who was thinking the right way and like who had the same sort of mentality as we did, it was important to get educated in this space. And so, like you mentioned, Nathan, there's a lot of great tools that TNC has about thinking about the way that we site renewables. And so reaching out and talking to, the Nature Conservancy, and working with other NGOs in the space to really understand, like, what are the issues? Like, what are the things that we should be concerned about? I think we had internally a list of ideas of what's important to us, but want to make sure that we're looking at it from all angles. And we're able to educate ourselves, and so that we could have a more informed discussion with developers. And our discussions with developers don't necessarily result in, we don't have like a list of requirements and the developers are giving us a list of answers, but it's more of like, let's talk about the issues. Let's talk about your perspective on the issues. What's your experience in the past? What do you see as issues on this project? What are your opportunities to address those issues? What are your opportunities to build in something more positive into this project? And looking for that long-term partnership. And so for us, it was a lot of external, outreach and education, internally, making sure everyone is understanding of that, and so that it's sort of built in terms of the way we look at this project from multiple aspects, so that we're getting a well-rounded project, something that we are happy to be a part of for many, many years to come, and something we feel is going to have a resulting, positive impact on the world and the communities in which we're going to operate.
Yeah, I think the things that Ryan talked about on collaboration are spot on. The thing that I would add to it is, with that collaboration has to also be transparency. All the groups have to be transparent in all their communication and actions, because that's the way you truly are an effective team. And if you don't have that collaboration, your project's going to stall. It's going to take longer to be done. And it's an upfront action to have the right people, the right folks involved, the right applications. And then with that transparent communication, it's also a matter of ensuring that everybody has a voice in that game, kind of that community side. But when I talk about that community side, it's also, whether it be your state agencies or your external stakeholders like the Nature Conservancy group or other activities that are out there. What are they seeing? Where are they at? How can we continue to promote our actions and promote their goals from a sustainability standpoint? Because as Ryan said it, Pepsi's a large corporation. Xcel Energy is a very large utility. Our corporate responsibility and our corporate reputation is huge to us. And we want to make sure that we're living exactly what we say in those spaces. So I think, having that aspect of having the right people involved, the right actions with that, and understanding, like Ryan said, I wish we all had a crystal ball, but I cannot think of one single project that went exactly like we thought it was going to happen. Something happened in between there, but we had the right people at the table. And if we didn't, we knew who to go to. And we were able to navigate through that. And some of that can be painful and some of it can be not, because like I said, you're dealing with large projects in large areas, and nature does what nature does. She becomes unpredictable. And it's very hard to navigate through that, but it can be done. And there's going to have to be the ability and the willingness to pivot and to make changes as you run through that to be substantial. So that's all I would add.
Thanks, Jeff and Ryan. So I think our last sort of teed up question here is just, I think for Ryan, this is, if you've had a chance to read the white paper. I'm assuming that the audience has read the white paper as well. And if you haven't, there's a link in the chat, so check it out. But the white paper itself is really focused on the US, right? And so, this climate crisis is a global issue. And I would be sort of interested to hear your sort of feedback on, how do you take these principles and broaden them beyond the borders of the US and think about it in a global capacity? For Jeff, right, you're working on these issues across multiple state lines. You're sitting in Colorado. You were just talking about a New Mexico issue right there. So, assume that these principles sort of apply broadly, but probably feature differently depending on, the region that Xcel is operating in. So maybe starting with Ryan on sort of that global question, and then transitioning over to Jeff.
Yeah, so I would say, we've had some success in terms of like integrating these 3Cs into our thinking and the way we go out and approach like large offsite renewables, specifically in the US. And we definitely have room to improve. And I think there's more that we can do in this area, and that is really exciting for me. But yeah, you're right. Like, this is not a US problem. It's a global problem. And so I work with all of our different teams around the globe on ways we can drive down our emissions by finding ways to transform, the markets out there around the world so that we can have more access to renewables. And it's really different everywhere we go. And I would say there's not like a one size fits all solution on how you address these things. I think it's important for us to have some guiding principles on what's really important for us, and like remind ourselves, like, why are we doing this and what are our options available to us? It's also important for us to remember that we don't have to have like the best project in the world in every single market, from day one. Like, there's a gradual, improvement over time in the way that we can drive more and more impact. So we always start maybe really small and say, like, what's something we can do to have a positive benefit, and then what's the next level above that? What's the next level above that? So we can set, a plan or a glide path or a long-term strategy to say, let's make an impact and let's do something that gets better over time. And then in getting better over time, understanding, like, what does that mean, not just for us, but what does that mean for the communities and the regions and the countries in which we're operating, and what are those specific concerns? So I think, a lot of times in North America, we're thinking wind and solar. I think in other parts of the world, there's a lot of offshore, there's a lot of hydro, there's some biomass, there's a lot of other things. So let's say, like, the thinking can't be really narrow and very, North American centric. It's going to be, 100 or 1,000 acres or more, of wind and solar development. It could be, very small projects. It could be lots of small projects. It could be projects in, very environmentally or culturally sensitive areas that we have to be really, really thoughtful about. And so, internally, we're sort of setting what those guidelines and principles are in terms of, like, what is the impact that we want to have, and how do we want to make sure that we're, getting the right sort of feedback signals in different parts of the world, so that we understand that we're in a line with not just what we think is our corporate values, but what are those community and country values that we want to be cognizant of as well. And so I would say we haven't, and by no means perfected this, but something that we're trying to integrate and build into the way that we approach our strategy as we, try to achieve our goals, but find a way to achieve our goals better, right? To improve constantly.
Yeah, and I think, Ryan, I'm sure you got some great stories. I can't imagine from the international side of that. I look at it as, in the United States and the United States we operate, it's just kind of a microcosm of that international. But I think the challenges are still the same. 9 different states, 9 different aspects of where they're at. We have some states that are willing to pay whatever it takes to be green and go 100% renewable. We have some other states that are saying, why are you retiring your coal? But yet we keep our vision the same with the entire company and where we're going and what that is. That wasn't just a carbon vision for 2 or 3 states. It was for all 9 states that we operate in. And so it's incumbent upon us to do a lot of the things like Ryan says and educate this. And we coined a phrase many years ago called steel for fuel. And that really resonated with a lot of people, especially in our regulators, to say, listen, we're replacing the costs of fuel with a cost of steel. So I'm taking coal or natural gas out of the equation and erecting steel in its place for a wind farm. And I no longer am now paying for that fuel to generate that electricity going forward. Over time, you can show a savings with that. And that really resonates with a lot of folks. And so we've been running through that paradigm. And so just educating the people and the commissions and the activities around that, demonstrating success with that. I think about 5 years ago, I think I had about 3 wind farms. I have 18 today, and I have another 10 coming on in the next 5 years. And that doesn't include what I'm going to do for solar and everything else. So just a lot going on there. And I think that's just a demonstration of how you can do it. And the last thing I would say, and this just goes for anything in life, it's kind of the way I've always said it. You can answer a question 2 ways. You can say, no, I can't do it. Or you can say, how can we do it? And we always try to bring that, how can we do it, to the table. There's going to be risks. There's going to be things associated with that. You need to balance them, like Brian said earlier, from a risk portfolio. But just always, okay, well, how can we do this? And if we can, what do we need to do to be successful? What are the steps? How do we address that? And then if we decide we're going to do it, let's go execute on it and be able to modify in the process.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeff. So, we have a few minutes left, probably not as much as anyone would like for audience questions here. But first, let's go ahead and stop the recording just from that perspective.